Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, Randall. Welcome to Afternoon of Brand Disruption Summit. Over the course of yesterday and today, whether we've been talking with founders or brand executives or really anyone in the value chain, one of the common refrains has been, it's a complex time. Quotes, heavy air quotes around that. And to survive and grow, you need to build resilient businesses. So we're going to talk about how you can build a resilient business with Mr. Michael Burke, Managing Director of Luxury Branded Apparel and Durables at Google. Michael, welcome to the IB stage.
Thank you. Not nearly as many adjectives that I didn't understand. Randall, you were obviously a much smarter man than I.
So we're talking about meeting consumers where they are. You've been at Google for about 20 years now, right?
Yeah.
And you've been advising partners on marketing and digital transformation in terms of how they better engage with consumers. What grounds your perspective? What grounds how you advise them to do that?
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's been a common theme through everything that I've sat through today and heard yesterday was this idea of focusing on the consumer. It sounds novel. It's something that we've all tried to do forever. I think it's rarely actually executed well. But there's a saying that we have at Google and we like to focus on, which is focus on the user and all else will follow. And I think that's increasingly becoming the way that we orient and what I hear my brand's trying to orient against. There was a conversation earlier about channels and how most brands had oriented around channels to begin with, right? Their business model necessitated that they did. But now I think there's a fundamental transition that's happening, and we're actually starting to try to execute against what we've tried to say for a long time.
Yeah. It's become more possible, but even more complex in meeting consumers where they are. What have you seen over the past 2 years? We've had a pandemic, we've had market fluctuations, we may be going to another market fluctuation now. Like, how have industries adapted over the past 2 years? What's working, what's not working?
Yeah, so I would say when I have conversations with executives, which is what I get to do in my role, a quick introduction. So I look over an ad sales business at Google, and I work with all the partners in the consumer brands categories. So everyone from Nike to Electrolux, Whirlpool, any of the big consumer brands. And I get the chance to meet with a bunch of executives. And I often cater those or tailor those conversations around a few focusing facts. And one of the ones that I think is really important related to what you said is an expectation of personalization. Right? And consumers now, one of the evolutions that's happened in consumer behavior change is there's now an expectation of true personalization. We've always said the best way to climb the proverbial brand arc is to connect with somebody on a personal passion, ideally when you're not trying to sell them something. And to your point, the capabilities to do that now are greater than ever, right? And the expectations of consumers are greater than ever. And if you're a brand that can't deliver against that value exchange, you've actually been left out. But to your second point, as technology has enabled us to make these connections, things like privacy evolution is in other ways restricting our ability to do that. So that's a little bit in conflict with each other. And so a lot of the conversations we're having is how do you deliver that like truly magical personalized experience without going into the kind of creepy realm.
And are there things in particular that you see working there versus not working there? Like any blinded success stories, or if you want to share a name in terms of what's worked, what hasn't worked?
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of people, when we talk about this idea of kind of one-to-one marketing, the worst execution of that is retargeting, right? And when we talk about an ad follows you around the web for the next year after you've put something in your cart, even if you purchase the product. I think that's lowest common denominator and actually the worst application of that. A magical experience, I'll use one of our properties, Google Maps. Right? I share my location information with Google Maps in order for it to get me where I'm going and tell me when I need to leave and how long it's going to take. Right. And so I firmly believe that as personal privacy evolves, people aren't going to stop sharing their personal information. Right? They will do so either consciously or unconsciously in exchange for a magical experience. Right. What's happening, though, is that they're now becoming a lot more conscious of who gets that information and how they use it. And so it's more important than ever for a brand to have some value exchange and provide some utility in exchange for opening that relationship with the consumer directly.
Right. And there's other ways. Move it out of advertising for now. Let's move it into commerce, e-commerce specifically, or commerce and brick and mortar retail. throughout the pandemic, we talk about meeting customers where they are.
Yeah.
There was a key, stores shut down, right? We, as a country, as a global society, we shut down for a while.
Yeah.
What did the pandemic do to change meeting the consumers where they are from a commerce and brick and mortar perspective? I mean, I think that was a huge change.
Yeah, there's been these wild swings, right? And it was talked about earlier today, this idea of the pandemic really forcing the development of all these capabilities that had been on roadmaps historically, but hadn't been prioritized. Right. Things like buy online, pick up in store, things like curbside pickup. Very few, I think in the teens digits percentage of companies could enable that pre-pandemic. It's now something like 70–80% of companies have that capability. And that was brought apart by necessity of stores being closed and having to define new models. And so I think that has been one of the sticky evolutions of the pandemic, is that there's now this expectation of seamless engagement with a brand. And one of the biggest challenges to that was this idea of merging e-commerce and store inventory. Right? Those have historically existed in two separate silos, and it was unfathomable pre-pandemic to think that you could do something like highlight real-time in-store inventory online, because that capability didn't exist.
Right. And
so now we say with all major evolutions, once a consumer's been introduced to it, even by one player, it becomes the expectation of all of them now. And so what used to be a strategic differentiator has now become a baseline capability that will deteriorate your brand if you can't deliver against it.
Yeah, the horses are out of the stable at that point.
Absolutely.
Consumers want that same level of service, whether it's brick and mortar interaction or e-commerce or some combination of the two. Another element of digital transformation that we talked about last week, that not consumers indirectly benefit from it, but it's not just about meeting consumers where they are. It's also about driving greater gross profit as a brand or a retailer, right? Like the ability to merge inventories, the ability to better manage shrink on a regional or local basis. Like, what are you seeing in that area?
Yeah, well, a ton of really interesting things. I think one of the things that I'm seeing, one of the great benefits that companies derived out of the pandemic in this merging of inventory is they started to reimagine their physical store footprint as e-commerce delivery points, right? Reducing the cost of that last mile delivery. So that was one of the key ones. I think as companies become more sophisticated, algorithmic decision making is becoming a foundation of most of the decisions that are being made. So there's applications in media that we can talk a little bit about in the way that you target and measure media. But there's also applications across all parts of the business. So one of the things
supply chain.
Exactly. One of the things that I think has been really interesting is as you start to feed these models with really cool first-party data like footfall traffic in individual stores, you can start to plan and put inventory in portions of the country or the world that reduces some of the friction of having to ship things across. Right. So there are a lot more levers to driving increased profitability in a time that we're going to need it. But it all is kind of built on this foundation of having that data that can fuel the algorithms.
Yep. Where are you seeing challenges in organizations, right? There are your legacy direct-to-consumer brands that have come about in the past decade or so that were kind of born in digital, right?
Yes.
But then there's a ton of legacy retailers out there that operated in we're in the brick and mortar world and are moving into e-commerce and starting to see those two come together. Where do the challenges lie in those businesses? What's their biggest obstacle to embracing digital transformation, use of data, introducing automation? What are the barriers they run into?
Yeah, outside of general inertia and lack of incentive to do so, I think the primary one is these silos that exist within organizations and partner ecosystems. So if you think about the businesses that I work on, these are brand manufacturers who have historically manufactured a product and then sold through third-party distribution, right? And that started to evolve. They've started to develop their own direct-to-consumer e-commerce businesses, but still, those businesses have lived in very separate silos, right? In a lot of cases, actually, I'm surprised how often I show up in a meeting and people from different parts of the organization will attend who have never heard of each other, don't know each other. Like they're that siloed even within an organization. And so when you start to think about orienting your business towards a consumer outcome, that creates a real challenge, right? Because the consumer doesn't see you as an e-commerce company and a wholesale company and a brick and mortar store company. They see you as a singular brand, and they want your product delivered in whatever distribution channel is most convenient for you at that time. And so breaking down those silos, and that's just one of them. I would say silos exist also in our partner ecosystems. So
yeah, talk a little bit about that. We talked about that last week.
When you think about the media landscape, right? Historically, brands have developed and have enabled brand marketing agencies, right? They have performance marketing agencies. In some cases, there's several divisions even within that. You have a mobile marketing agency, you have a performance marketing agency, you have an affiliate network, right? These are all friction points to being able to deliver against a seamless customer experience. And so that's another place where brands who really want to make this change are having to rethink the way that they're organized. And organizational change management is tough. This is huge. It takes a lot of time, it takes effort, it takes incentive changes, it takes a whole host of things, and it doesn't move quickly. And so as we're trying to keep up with the consumer, we're hindered or burdened by some of these organizational structures that have historically been built for good reason.
Where does that change start? Who's most capable of affecting that change in these organizations?
Yeah, great question. It takes, I often say, when you're talking about maybe the division or the merging of e-com and store, it takes somebody who cares about the enterprise, not one of the single channels. And typically that goes all the way up to the C-suite. And even in most cases above that, because a lot of times you've got your CMO who owns all of the kind of brand and store and all of that, the messaging, and then you've got a totally different performance group. And so a lot of times it goes to the CEO or even the board before you really start caring about shareholder value, and that's where you start caring about delivery against the enterprise. Outside or in the absence of being able to fast forward organizational change management, I find one of the best hacks for merging the two is aligning against a single KPI. Even if you're not going to realign the organizations, if you can all agree on a single measured KPI, you can start to work in much better unison. So whether that be a profitability target or a new customer acquisition target, you can start to hack and merge those groups through a change in targets and measurement, even in the absence of real org change.
Do you see distinctions between the retailer, those that have the brand's product on the store shelves or in their e-commerce portal, versus the brand? Do those challenges lie both at a brand level as well as a retailer level, or are they similar challenges? Yeah. Are they thinking about their consumer in a siloed fashion, or is the brand thinking more holistically? The retailer may be thinking more brick and mortar versus e-commerce.
I think the retailers have been faster to move because they have more historical capabilities in that space. I think it's the same challenge between the two. And when you think about brand manufacturers themselves, these have been B2B companies historically.
Right.
And so the idea of consumer orientation and becoming a retailer in their own right is new muscle memory. So I think the brands have been much slower to it because even the largest of the e-commerce and direct-to-consumer businesses, called Nike for their direct offense, still they're pushing towards, call it 40-50% direct-to-consumer. They still are very much a B2B company.
Right.
And most of the manufacturers are some years behind that.
Right, and not every brand necessarily has the luxury of a Nike or some other more direct-to-consumer brand. Like, you're not necessarily going to buy Q-tips direct to consumer, right? That's one example. So
yeah,
different challenges, depending on the type of brand you are.
Yeah, different categories, no doubt, more speedy to direct to consumer for all of those reasons. Financial being a primary one.
Got it.
Yeah.
So, living through and advising your partners on all this change for 2 decades, what are some of the strategic opportunities retail marketers should look for as we enter the holiday season? We go into potentially rocky waters in the global economy. Like, where should retail marketers focus?
Yeah. So one of the areas that I think is massively important, I'll put under the umbrella of automation. And we talked a little bit about the decision making algorithmically, but if we take it to media, the ability to automate your media targeting and delivery systems. Right. We talked about, I think back to when I first joined Google, and we talked about personalization of marketing and media. Google search was really the first time in history that you as a marketer could take an input, somebody searching on something, and deliver your product or service in response. And we made it like this magical experience. We had this thing called keyword insertion, where the actual keyword that somebody searched for could be dynamically placed into the ad text of the creative that we would deliver. And it was like magical personalization, right? We've now merged to where this proverbial purchase funnel doesn't exist anymore. The
Right.
upside down triangle, right? People are going across different platforms, different experiences. They're consuming video. They're doing searches. They're always in market for product. And so the number of surfaces has expanded. The types of media that you need to reach them with has expanded. And the information that you have to personalize that message has changed.
Right.
And so there's no way that even an army of people can manually do this. And so all of that media execution is moving towards a more automated model. And so as I talk with partners, driving media through automation targeted towards a true business outcome is where the leading brands are focusing right now. And what I mean by a more brand or a consumer outcome, more sophisticated consumer outcome, things like profitability,
right.
things like customer acquisition cost, as opposed to the more traditional cost per click or even ROI.
Right. You talking about driving to outcomes. You also, that's often it's automated and it's also very data driven.
Yep.
You opened with this new privacy paradigm
Yes.
that retailers and brands and really any advertisers living in. What role does first party data play here? How can you share your sentiments on how critical, how important that is, or not?
Yeah.
To act as a differentiator and even a change agent? Like, what role does first-party data play in all of this?
Yeah, I mean, it's come up again a lot today. I think it's imperative. I think it is the way that you're going to effectively drive your brand and business in the future. But one of the things I think is a little bit of a fallacy is this idea that there needs to be a one-to-one marketing. And what I mean by that is I think we all historically have thought of cookie-based or some kind of one-to-one marketing being that I will know Michael Burke or I will know Tony individually, mm-hmm. and I will literally market a message to that person based on all these things that I know about them. That's breaking down, right? And we're moving to a world where cohorts right. are going to be the model as opposed to one-to-one engagements. And so
there's questions of one-to-one even, does it really scale?
Yeah, and I think it doesn't. And particularly with the way things are moving, that's not what consumers are demanding. That's not what technology is enabling. Mm-hmm. And so we're moving to much more of a cohort-based model. And you can get pretty darn good in that. It doesn't have to be one-to-one. I think we said the word creepy a couple times already. One-to-one often ends up feeling kind of creepy. Cohort starts to feel like they hear me, they understand my personal passion, they're delivering a message that's tailored to that, but not in a way that offends me or causes me to feel a little bit icky about the relationship. And when we talked about some of the key things, particularly the younger generations focused on right now, right, mm-hmm. around sustainability and inclusivity, these are hopefully core to a brand. And within those larger categories, you can start to put a pretty good tailored message in front of a cohort that performs, by our estimations, just as well and sometimes better than that one-to-one connection.
Yep. Do you see breakdowns or silos also from a data perspective, particularly at the retail side? Yes. I don't know if you see it at the retail side, the brand side as well. But.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's really interesting. I hear a lot of people using the word democratization of data mm-hmm. within organizations now, and I think that makes a lot of sense to me. When you talk about these huge enterprise organizations, a lot of times they have a lot more data than they think they have. Right? A great example is when we're working with folks who are primarily selling through third-party wholesale relationships. And the marketing team says, look, we really have no insight into closed-loop attribution. We don't know what happens once that product is shipped to our wholesale partners and is sold. They actually do, right? The teams that are selling to their third parties or their retail partners get a host of data back from them. It's just not democratized throughout the organization. The direct-to-consumer group, the marketing group often doesn't have access to that.
Right.
So what a lot of companies are doing first is just taking stock of what data actually already exists, right? And a lot of people, they get overwhelmed with the amount of data that they actually have. They have huge amounts of data, very few insights. And so one of the first steps that you take is figure out what all the data that exists, consumer data, across the entire organization, and bring it into a single place. And then you can start to catalog, leverage, and use it once you provide access to everyone. Another one of the challenges that comes with silos is in bringing all that data together, there's a lot of times some defensiveness and ownership over who owns that data, even within an organization.
Goes back to those cultural headwinds.
It does. We're all trying to sell the same thing, but those groups, there's some competitive nature still within organizations, right? Because you may be only interested in driving your e-commerce business or your wholesale business, and you've got a 2-decade-old relationship with the person that you've sold to at your biggest retailer, and sharing that information with the e-com team that is a little bit competitive is sometimes at risk.
Right.
And so, yeah, that's back to the organizational change and incentive component, but you need to democratize information and customer information within an organization in order to deliver it and effectively leverage it.
Right, and that comes back to the C-suite where we talked about last week. Show me an organization's behavior, and I'll tell you pretty closely what their compensation structure is.
No doubt.
Tell me their compensation structure, and I'll tell you pretty closely what their behavior is. So
yeah.
There needs to be. It's data silos, it's inventory silos, but it's also it's incentive silos. Right?
It is.
You're incentivizing people differently for different outcomes, so that can often be in conflict with one another, and that's a huge challenge.
Yeah, in preparation for meetings, a lot of times I'll go to one of the physical brick and mortar stores of a partner, and I'll intentionally find something that's not in my size, and I'll ask about it. And if they send me to an online experience, I know exactly how they're incentivized. If they try to sell me something else in my size, I know exactly how they're incentivized. And that's a great way to start a conversation with an executive team is, I tried to buy your product you want to sell, and there was that friction point.
Right, I couldn't get the product I wanted as a consumer.
That's right.
Right. What are leading indicators? How do you look at, as you advise these partners and they go down the path of implementing these concepts, what are leading indicators of success? Unified KPI, but what are some other leading indicators you'll see? And they're on the right path. Those are good examples of success.
Yeah, well, the unified KPI, I think that is the litmus test for it, right? Are people aligning against a singular outcome? Communication within the organization, agility within the organization. You can start to look into those things. I think, yeah, those would be the ones that I would focus on initially. I feel like I'm beating a dead horse a little bit in the fact that it really does come to aligning the incentives and the measurement. I think even just in the data points themselves, and coming up with a standard scorecard for how you're delivering against something, and everyone literally signing in on this is what we're going to measure against.
Do you think there's also a fear of failure approach, like a fear of, test and scale, test and learn? No one wants to. You're not going to get it right the first time out of the gate. Do you think that's a challenge as well?
It is, and it actually, as we're talking about it, brings me to a larger concept, which is there's historically been this almost friction between the CMO and the CFO, right? Marketing just generally has been seen as a cost center as opposed to a growth center. And so a lot of times we're talking about becoming more agile in the way that you think about marketing, right? And if you can demonstrate performance against a shared KPI, is there the flexibility and agility of budget to go chase where demand exists? And I would say particularly in this constricting environment, you have to go find sales where you can, right? And you have to go find profitability where you can. And historically, the budgets, because they've been set annually probably across channel and they're pretty rigid, it doesn't allow you the flexibility to execute agilely the way that you need to, right? Historical comps are almost worthless at this point because even a 3-year CAGR is a mess, right? You can't really predict holiday, for example, when it's going to peak. It used to be a 5-day period. Now we're thinking it's more like a couple months. You need agility to execute across any of those uncertainties. And if you're locked into these historical models, you're really at challenge. And so that's where I think part of the shift is happening is the marketing team saying, look, if I can prove this to you, CFO, if I can prove that we are a growth center as opposed to a cost center, do I have the flexibility and leeway to actually execute against where opportunity exists?
And did the pandemic really change that? Was that pandemic influence? Was that what threw off that kind of traditional approach?
Yeah, the pandemic no doubt did. I think actually the uncertainty and the lack of comps that I kind of just mentioned is really changing the game. Because most retailers, most brands have historically been very grounded in backward-looking year-over-year comps, whether that be by store, whether that be by product category. That's how they've planned. That's how they've budgeted. all of those things. So over the last 3 years, year-over-year comps have become almost irrelevant, right? And so they've needed to find new models, or they're caught guessing. And we still haven't figured that out, right? I mean, a lot of the brands are still really struggling right now with the demand not matching the supply and it having just swapped, like we talked about earlier today. But I think that has been a real change in the way that people plan and think, is because they haven't had those historical year-over-year comps to plan against, and so they've had to become more agile.
Right. Yeah. Well, but the data will inform that. Right?
Yeah.
You don't have to rely on these year-over-year comps anymore. You've got a steady stream of data. I want to close with this for the audience, for folks listening virtually. The technology is there to enable this today for brands, their retail partners, retail marketers, direct-to-consumer brands. And the data is available if they leverage the technology appropriately. There's nothing holding back these organizations really, except for cultural inertia, alignment of incentives. I mean, is that a largely true statement?
I would say absolutely.
They have the power to do this.
Yes, and I would say the one thing that I would leave them with is act against what we've been saying for a long time, which is truly orient around the customer. That begins with setting a singular KPI that's shared across the organization, that's grounded in a consumer business outcome, and then use automation and technology because it can execute a lot more agilely than humans.
Yeah, great. Thank you, Michael.
All right.
Very insightful.
Nice
Thank you so much.